She was bleeding into the sand when he found her, beads scattered from her torn dress, eyes blazing with defiance even as her body gave way. The desert wind carried the scent of dust and iron, and the sun poured its merciless fire over the wide expanse. John Carter stopped in his tracks, rifle still in his hand, his boots half buried in the drift of red sand. He had seen men die on battlefields and cattle rot beneath the buzzards, but he had never seen a woman fight so fiercely against the earth that sought to swallow her. Her hand pressed tight against her side, the fabric dark with blood, her breath short and ragged. Even wounded, even broken, there was something unyielding in the way she glared at him. He knew that look. It was the same he had once seen in the eyes of soldiers who would rather meet death than accept mercy. She whispered something hoarse, the single word clear enough despite the rasp. "Leave." John crouched beside her, the desert heat rising around them like a living thing. He could see the trail behind her now, smudges of boot prints, scattered beads, a dark ribbon of blood leading from the far hills. She had not fallen here by chance.
She had been chased, driven, left to die. His instincts told him to step back, to let the desert claim what it had already started. Every law of survival he had lived by as a rancher, and before that as a soldier, told him not to take on burdens that weren't his. But something deeper moved in him, older than law, older than the grudges that ran between his kind and hers. He set his rifle down slowly, his voice low, carrying no command and no pity, only a promise. "I won't leave you alone." The words slipped from him like a vow spoken to the empty sky. She frowned, lips trembling with disbelief, but she did not have the strength to resist when he gathered her in his arms. She was light, too light, bones sharp beneath skin, weathered by both labor and loss. Her breath came shallow against his chest as he lifted her, steadying her weight. The desert wind rose in a sudden gust, carrying a cry that might have been the voice of men or the wail of coyotes. John turned his head, scanning the open waste. Whoever had driven her here was not far behind. He shifted her in his grip and started across the sand toward the lone shape of his ranch house, a dark outline against the shimmering horizon.
Above them, the sun blazed like judgment, and yet John felt a strange shield settle over him. The verse his mother had once whispered in his boyhood came unbidden to mind, echoing now in the furnace of the desert. "He will cover you with his feathers, and under his wings you will find refuge. You will not fear the terror of night, nor the arrow that flies by day." Psalm 91, 4-5. The girl stirred weakly at the sound of his voice as he murmured the verse under his breath, though she did not know the words. Her eyes fluttered shut at last, surrendering to exhaustion. John tightened his hold and pressed onward. The ranch was still miles away, but turning back was no longer in him. The house stood at the edge of the desert like a forgotten sentinel. Walls of weathered adobe and timber, the roof patched in places where storms had torn it through the years. It was not much, but it was the only shelter for miles. John shouldered the door open with a grunt, dust spilling in from the wind, and carried the girl across the threshold. Inside, the air was cooler, though it smelled of old wood smoke and leather. He laid her gently on a cot near the hearth, where the embers of last night's fire still smoldered. Her body tensed even in her weakness, muscles stiff as though she would rather drag herself back into the desert than lie in his home. Her hand moved clumsily to tear away the strip of cloth he had pressed against her wound. "No," she muttered, her voice a rasp of fury and pain. "Not from you." John did not answer. He set his jaw, poured water from a clay jug into a tin basin, and tore a clean strip from an old shirt. He had learned long ago that silence could outlast defiance. She could fight his help with words, but she had no strength left to push him away. His hands, calloused from years of rope and saddle, worked with surprising care as he pressed the bandage into place. Her eyes flashed, dark with suspicion. He knew what she saw, not a savior, but another enemy, another white man who had brought nothing but ruin to her people.
He did not deny it. He only kept working, binding the wound with steady hands until her body finally sagged back against the cot, too weary to resist further. Outside, the wind rose, rattling the shutters like bones against the walls. The desert storm was coming. He could feel it in the air, in the taste of grit on his tongue. Sandstorms here were not mere weather. They were tempests that scoured the skin and choked the lungs. Storms that buried trails and erased whole nights of travel. The girl flinched as the first blast struck the side of the house, a low roar rolling across the plains. John set a log onto the coals in the hearth, coaxing flames to life. Light filled the small room, pushing back the shadows, while the storm clawed at the walls. She turned her face from him, her pride still sharp as steel even in defeat. He offered her a tin cup of water. She hesitated, lips pressed into a hard line, then finally sipped. Not much, but enough to show she had not yet surrendered her life. John sat back on a stool across the fire, his rifle leaning against the wall within reach. He watched her quietly as the storm raged, and she, too weary to argue further, closed her eyes with the blanket pulled to her chin. Her body braced, as though still waiting for betrayal, yet she allowed herself the smallest measure of rest. John leaned his head against the wall and listened to the storm shriek over the desert. He had not asked for this burden, but he had taken it all the same. Somewhere beyond the walls, men still hunted her. He knew the storm would not keep them forever, but for tonight, in the silence between them, he kept his vow alive. I won't leave you alone. CTA 1. The storm had passed in the night, leaving the desert hushed and brittle. Sand lay piled against the walls of the ranch house, dust settling in every corner. Inside, the silence was not peace, but a waiting tension, as though the earth itself held its breath. Ahyoka lay on the cot, her face pale beneath the firelight. Her lips were cracked, her body weak, yet when John offered her water, she turned her head away. The tin cup trembled in his hand, but she would not take it. Her eyes met his with the fire of someone who would rather perish than appear dependent. He set the cup down without a word. He had seen pride before, on the battlefield, and broken men clinging to their last scraps of honor. But this was different. This was a pride woven from centuries of survival, from a people driven into the margins of the land. He did not argue. Silence, he knew, could sometimes do more than insistence. Instead, he busied himself with the work of care. He gathered mesquite branches from the woodpile outside, their sweet smoke filling the room as he coaxed the fire higher. He boiled water in a blackened pot, dropped in desert herbs he had gathered long ago, their sharp scent cutting through the air. He carried the basin to her side, dipped a cloth, and pressed it against her wound. She flinched as though the touch burned, her hand rising to push him away. But she had no strength left. Her arm fell back to her side, and her jaw tightened in silent rebellion. John bound the cloth carefully, knotting it in place with the same patience he once used to mend saddle leather. The hours dragged. Outside, the desert baked under the sun, and inside, she fought against him with every flicker of her will. She would not eat the bread he laid near her. She would not sip from the broth he left cooling by the hearth. Only once did she stir, fingers brushing the broken beads scattered on the floor, gathering them as though they were pieces of herself that must not be lost. John watched, but he did not speak. He remembered the scripture his mother used to read, words that had seemed distant once, but now felt near. A bruised reed he will not break, and a smoldering wick he will not snuff out. He thought of those words as he looked at her, fragile, fierce, both near breaking and yet burning still. As night crept in, coyotes howled from the ridge beyond the ranch. Ahyoka's eyes opened at the sound, and her body stiffened, as though every echo of the wild reminded her of pursuit. She turned toward him then, voice barely more than a whisper. "They will come." John met her gaze steadily. He did not ask who they were, nor why they had hunted her. That would come in its time. For now, all that mattered was the vow he had already given. "I won't leave you," he said softly, almost to himself, but the words lingered in the hush like a promise etched into the very air. And in that silence, sharper than any storm, the desert waited. By the second night, the desert's heat had turned against her. What little strength Ahyoka clung to melted into fever, her skin damp beneath the blanket, her body trembling as though some unseen hand wrung her dry. John set another log on the fire and watched her chest rise and fall in shallow rhythm. At first, her murmurs were scattered and faint, words broken by pain. Then they grew clearer, though carried on the fragile thread of delirium. Names slipped past her lips, soft syllables of people he did not know. A brother, a mother, perhaps a child. John sat motionless, knowing better than to intrude on the voices of memory. She turned suddenly, eyes half open, and hissed a word that cut sharper than any blade. Traitor. Her hand clenched the blanket as if strangling an unseen throat. They sold us. They sold me. The words fell apart into a sob, and then into silence. John stared at the floorboards, jaw tight. He had no right to those words, no claim to the pain behind them. Still, each syllable drove into him like a spur, stirring memories of his own. The day he returned from war to find his land stripped, his family buried and ground too hard to weep over. Different lives, different blood, yet loss spoke the same language. He rose, poured cool water into a basin, and pressed the cloth to her brow. She did not resist this time. Her body was too far gone, her mind drifting between worlds. The coyotes had stilled outside, leaving only the whisper of sand against the shutters. In that quiet, he found himself speaking, not to her, but to the walls, to the God he had not prayed to in years. His voice cracked like dry wood. "Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death," he whispered, "I will fear no evil, for you are with me." The words hung heavy in the dim room, half confession, half plea. He had spoken them once long ago on a battlefield littered with dying boys, and he had sworn never to utter them again. But here, beside this woman who fought both enemies outside and fever within, the verse returned unbidden, as though it had been waiting all along. Ahyoka stirred, a faint sound breaking from her throat, a word in her tongue that he could not understand. Her hand reached blindly across the cot, and for a moment her fingers brushed his wrist. Then, as if realizing the contact, she pulled away with the last flicker of strength. John did not move to claim the space she had withdrawn. He only sat back down, hands folded, eyes on the fire as it cracked and popped against the silence. Her whispers grew fainter as the fever dragged her deeper into its hold. Names still came, mingled with curses against the hunters who had driven her to this place. John listened. He did not press, did not demand. Some truths belonged to the wounded until they chose to speak them whole. When her breathing finally steadied into uneasy sleep, John leaned against the wall and closed his eyes. Outside, the desert stretched vast and merciless. Inside, the secrets of two broken lives lay tangled in the hush, waiting for the storm that would come next. By the third day, the desert rose in fury. The storm came from the south, swallowing the horizon in a wall of red dust. John had seen sandstorms before, but this one carried a weight that seemed intent on grinding every living thing into silence. He barred the windows with planks, wedged cloth into the cracks, and secured the door. Still, dust forced its way through the seams, swirling into the cabin like ghostly smoke. The air thickened with grit until every breath rasped against the throat. Ahyoka stirred on the cot, her eyes wide in the flickering light. The roar outside was like 1,000 voices crying at once. She pushed herself up on one elbow, clutching the blanket as though it were a shield. Her lips moved without sound, but John saw the tremor in her jaw. "It won't take the house," he said quietly, though he wasn't sure if she heard him above the gale. He set another log in the fire, its glow battling against the storm's shadow. "You're safe here." Her gaze flicked to him, uncertain, then back to the shuttered window. He recognized that look, the memory of pursuit bending itself into every new sound. He had carried that same fear once, when the war left him stranded in a land that no longer felt like his own. The storm raged through the night, hammering the cabin with fists of dust. Every gust seemed to scrape at the roof, tug at the walls, threaten to tear the place apart. John stayed awake, rifle across his lap, though no enemy could have fought their way through the storm. It wasn't men he guarded against, but the weight of loneliness that pressed harder with each hour. Toward midnight, Ahyoka's voice broke through the howling. "Why?" she asked, the word nearly lost in the storm. "Why help me?" John looked at her, the question sharp as any blade. He did not answer right away. The truth was complicated, tangled in scars he rarely touched. "Finally," he said, "because I couldn't walk away." Her eyes narrowed, searching him as though to measure whether the words were true. Then she turned her face aside, silent again. But her body eased, her shoulders loosening, her hand no longer clutching the blanket as tightly. For the first time, she accepted a sip of water when he offered it. Just a swallow, but it was enough to crack the wall of refusal she had built. John said nothing, only settled back onto the stool, listening as the fire hissed against the gale. Hour after hour, the storm hammered. At last, the first pale light of dawn seeped through the cracks in the shutters, dim and dust-colored. The storm had not passed, but it had spent its fiercest rage. Inside, the cabin still stood, and within it, two lives endured the silence together. Not in trust, not yet, but no longer in complete defiance. By the week's end, the fever took hold like fire in dry grass. Ahyoka's skin burned hot beneath the back of John's hand, her breath ragged and shallow. She tossed against the cot, whispering broken fragments of her tongue, words that sounded like names, curses, and prayers all at once. John had done what he could, boiled herbs, changed bandages, fetched cool water from the well. None of it slowed the heat that consumed her. He sat beside her, shoulders heavy with helplessness, the rifle forgotten in the corner. The desert outside might rage with men or storms, but the real battle now burned in her fragile frame. She cried out once, her voice rising above the storm's howl. "Don't take me," she whispered, eyes unfocused, "not like the others." Her fingers clawed at the air as if reaching for someone beyond the room. John gripped her hand, startled at the thinness of her bones beneath his calloused palm. "Hold on," he said, though the words felt empty. He had seen fever strip the strongest men down to husks. He had buried friends with soil still damp from the sweat of their dying. For a long time, he sat in silence, listening to her ramblings fade into weak whimpers. His chest tightened with a pressure he hadn't felt in years. He had left prayer behind on the battlefields of Virginia, when the smoke and blood convinced him God no longer walked with men. Yet now, with this woman slipping away before his eyes, words he thought long buried rose unbidden to his lips. "Lord!" His voice cracked. He swallowed hard and tried again. "Lord, if you are still listening, don't take her, not like this." He bowed his head, words tumbling out raw and unpolished. "I don't know why she came into my path. Maybe you do. I've turned from you for years, but tonight I've got nothing left to hold on to. If you're still here, spare her." The fire hissed low, casting shadows that trembled across the walls. For the first time in years, John let his heart split open. He whispered the verse that had once carried him through the valley of war, the words tasting both foreign and familiar on his tongue. "He heals the broken-hearted and binds up their wounds." Psalm 147:3. The verse settled into the silence like a balm. John pressed the damp cloth against her brow, his hands trembling. His vision blurred, and only when a tear splashed onto her cheek did he realize he was weeping. He turned his face away, ashamed, yet unable to stop the tears that came as steady as the desert rain he had not seen in months. Ahyoka stirred faintly. For a fleeting moment her eyes opened, clouded and weak, yet clear enough to catch the glimmer of wetness on his cheek.
She did not speak, but something shifted in her gaze. Then exhaustion dragged her back into unconsciousness. John leaned back, chest heaving, his prayer still echoing in the dim room. He had begged for her life, not knowing if heaven had heard. But for the first time in years, he felt less alone in the silence. The fever broke with the coming of dawn. John woke in the chair beside the cot, his neck stiff, his body numb from long hours of watching. The air was cool at last, the storm's dust having settled into silence. When he looked to her, he saw a change. Her skin no longer burning, her breathing deeper, steadier. Ahyoka's eyes opened slowly, heavy with exhaustion. She searched the room as though unsure whether she still walked this world. John rose, poured water into the tin cup, and held it out. For the first time, she did not turn away. Her hands trembled as she took it, sipping with care, but she drank. It was a small thing, yet in the hush of the cabin it felt like a covenant. Her strength returned slowly in the days that followed. She sat upright now, mending torn cloth with stitches that faltered at first, then grew steadier. When he returned from checking the cattle pens, he found the blanket folded neatly at the foot of the cot, the hearth swept clean of ashes. She did not speak of gratitude, but the small order she brought into the room was thanks enough. John worked as he always had, hauling mesquite wood from the grove, setting snares for rabbit, riding out to the creek for water. The desert offered little, but what it gave he took with steady patience. When he returned with the day's catch, he set it by the fire where she simmered broth in the old iron pot. There were still walls between them. Her eyes carried caution, her body tensed when his shadow fell too close. But there were moments, brief and fragile, where those walls cracked. Once, when he passed her a bowl, their hands brushed. She did not pull away. That night, when the wind rose again across the desert, Ahyoka sat by the fire and hummed a tune so soft it might have been the desert itself singing. The melody carried sorrow, its notes bending like branches beneath too much weight. John did not know the words, yet he felt the ache of them in his chest. He sat in silence, eyes on the flames, letting the sound fill the room. She faltered once, her voice catching, but she continued. When the last note faded, the cabin seemed changed, not brighter, not lighter, but fuller, as if a space long hollow had been touched by breath. He glanced at her then. Her eyes were on the fire, not on him, but her hands were steady, folded in her lap. For the first time since he had found her bleeding in the sand, she looked less like a stranger and more like someone who belonged in the same room. John leaned back in his chair, the silence between them no longer heavy with defiance, but softened into something that felt almost like peace. The desert had not relented, nor had the threat beyond the horizon vanished. Yet, inside these walls, in the fragile harmony of two lives scarred by loss, something new was taking root. The desert shifted with the season. Winter's harsh breath gave way to days where the air carried warmth, and nights no longer threatened frost. From the cracks in the earth, wildflowers rose in stubborn defiance, yellow blossoms clinging to the edges of stone, red petals burning against the sand. John had lived long enough in the desert to know its mercies were rare and fleeting. Ahyoka walked again beneath the open sky, her steps slow but steady. The scar along her side pulled with each movement, yet she moved without complaint. Her dark hair, once matted with dust and blood, now caught the sun in long strands as the wind carried it behind her. She paused often, gazing toward the distant horizon where the mesas cut jagged against the sky. John split logs at the woodpile, his axe ringing in the air. He watched her in the space between swings, careful not to let his gaze linger. He knew that look. It was the look of someone listening to a call far older than words. Her people, her past, the land itself, all waiting beyond the horizon. At night, when the coyotes sang and the fire cracked in the hearth, the silence between them grew different. It was no longer the silence of strangers, nor the strained hush of distrust, but something fragile, balanced on the edge of choice. She would sit near the fire, her hands busy with thread and cloth, while he cleaned his rifle or mended tack. Occasionally their eyes met. Neither spoke, yet something passed between them all the same. One evening, as the last light sank behind the ridges, Ahyoka stood outside the cabin, her face turned toward the west. "They will be waiting," she said softly, not looking back at him. John leaned against the doorway, his hands resting on the frame. "Your people?" She nodded once. Her shoulders squared, though her voice trembled. "I should return. Honor says so." He said nothing. He had no claim to bind her here, no right to ask her to stay. The desert wind stirred the loose strands of her hair, carrying the weight of her words into the dusk. But when she turned at last, her eyes lingered on him. There was no accusation in them, no hatred, only conflict. The pull of duty against the fragile seed of belonging that had begun to grow in this unlikely refuge. She returned inside without another word, and John followed. He added a log to the fire, the sparks leaping into the chimney like stars. She sat across from him, sewing in silence, but her hands trembled with each stitch. John studied her, then looked away. He did not speak the thought that pressed in his chest, that sometimes the desert itself chose where a soul belonged, no matter what the past demanded. Outside, the wildflowers swayed beneath the moonlight, blooming where no life was meant to last. Inside, two lives waited in the quiet, caught between roads not yet chosen. CTA-2. The desert had been too quiet all morning. John felt it before he saw it, the unease that settled into his chest, the way even the cattle moved slow and restless. The air shimmered with heat, yet beneath it lay something heavier, a tension he could not shake. From the ridge above the ranch, his eyes caught the first sign, a line of dust rising in the distance, smudging the blue horizon. It was the kind of dust made by riders, not wind. His jaw tightened as he lowered the spyglass he rarely used, the glint of sunlight flashing once across the metal. They were still far, but they were coming. Smoke drifted faint from behind them, not from a campfire, but from a brush blaze lit without care. Whoever they were, they left a trail meant to be seen, or else they didn't fear being followed. Either way, it was a warning. John turned back toward the ranch. Ahyoka was kneeling near the corral, her hands steady as she tied fresh reeds into the water trough. She looked up at him, sensing the shift in his posture before he spoke. Her eyes narrowed against the sun, scanning the horizon. She didn't need to ask. "They've found the trail," John said. His voice was flat, steady, but it carried the weight of inevitability. Her fingers stilled on the rope. For a moment she looked as if she might flee, as if the instinct that had carried her bleeding through the desert might rise again. But her body did not move. Her gaze fixed on the thin plume of dust, and in it she saw not just the men who hunted her, but the memories that had driven her to collapse in the sand weeks ago. John felt the shift in the air, the moment when choice dissolved. This was the point of no return. There would be no more hiding, no more waiting for storms to cover their tracks. The desert had brought the danger to his door, and now he would meet it here. He walked back to the cabin, lifted the rifle from its place by the door, and checked the chamber with practiced care. The sound of metal sliding into place echoed sharp in the stillness. From behind him, Ahyoka spoke low. "They will not stop." John looked back at her, the rifle resting against his arm. "Then neither will I." The horizon darkened as the dust cloud grew, the shapes of riders beginning to form against the light. The desert, so vast and silent, seemed to hold its breath. Even the wind stilled, as though the land itself waited for the clash that could no longer be delayed. John stepped onto the porch, boots heavy against the wood, rifle steady in his grip. For months, solitude had been his shield. Now it would be tested, not for himself, but for the life he had vowed not to abandon. The riders grew clearer with every passing minute. their shapes rising from the haze of dust like ghosts returning from some old war. John counted 4, maybe 5, though the shifting light blurred their number. They rode with purpose, their silhouettes sharp against the glare, like men who had followed blood too long to turn back now. Inside the cabin, Ahyoka sat near the fire, though no warmth was needed. Her hands gripped the edge of the cot, knuckles white, shoulders taut as bowstrings. Each hoofbeat carried across the open desert seemed to strike her chest like a drum of memory. John set his rifle across his lap and began the quiet ritual he knew by heart, checking the chamber, testing the sight, running his thumb along the barrel. His movements were slow, deliberate, the way a man steadies himself by routine when the storm builds. Ahyoka's breath came fast, uneven. "I know them," she whispered. The words trembled in the dim light. "I know their voices. They hunted us before." She faltered, eyes closing, as if the memory itself could swallow her whole. John glanced up from his work, his expression carved from stone. "You're safe here." Her laugh was bitter, thin. "Safe? No one is safe from them. Not my people, not even me." She pressed her hands against her temples, shaking her head as if to banish the ghosts. "They took what they wanted. They burned what was ours. I ran, and I ran." Her voice cracked, breaking like dry earth underfoot. John said nothing. He let her words fall, the silence between them filling with the weight of all that had been lost. He understood the kind of fear that hollowed a person from the inside. He had carried it himself after the war, when he returned to land stripped bare, to graves dug too shallow for the ones he loved. The sound of riders carried closer now, low voices shouting, the clink of harnesses, the ring of metal against saddle. Dust washed across the horizon like a storm about to break. Ahyoka looked at him then, eyes wide with something rawer than fear. "You can still send me away. If they find me here, they will kill you too." John met her gaze, steady and unflinching. He slid the rifle shut with a sharp click. "I gave you my word," he said. She shook her head, tears brimming though she refused to let them fall. "Words mean nothing to men like them." "Then they'll learn what mine is worth," John answered. His voice was low, but it carried the weight of stone. Outside, the first shout rang clear across the desert, her name torn from the wind in a tone half command, half curse. Ahyoka's body jolted as though struck, her breath catching sharp. John rose to his feet, rifle in hand, and moved to the doorway. The time for silence was gone. The storm had reached them. The riders crested the low ridge as the sun slid toward the horizon, their outlines sharp against the burning sky. Dust swirled in their wake, cloaking them in the same red haze that had carried them across the desert. John stepped onto the porch, rifle loose in his grip but steady, his frame filling the doorway like a sentinel. The men pulled up short of the corral, horses snorting, hooves churning sand. There were 5 of them, rough-faced and lean, their eyes scanning the ranch with the hunger of wolves circling prey. One spat into the dust, then cupped his hands to his mouth and shouted, "Ahyoka!" The name split the air like a whip crack. Behind John, inside the cabin's shadow, Ahyoka flinched. Her fingers clutched the blanket at her side, her breath caught in her throat. The sound of her name on their tongues was not a summons, but a claim, a reminder of chains she had fled. John did not move. His eyes stayed fixed on the riders, his jaw set. The leader urged his horse a step closer. His voice rang harsh, sharp with authority. "Send her out. She belongs to us." The desert seemed to hold its breath. Even the wind stilled, leaving only the creak of leather, the shifting of hooves, the distant cry of a hawk overhead. John raised the rifle just enough that the meaning was clear. She belongs to no one. A murmur rippled among the riders. Hands shifted near their holsters, eyes narrowing. The leader's mouth twisted into a sneer. "You don't know what you're protecting, rancher. She's a traitor to her own."
You think she'll stay here with you? She'll bleed you dry, same as the rest." John's grip tightened on the rifle, but he did not fire. His silence carried the weight of a man who heard every lie men told to excuse cruelty. Inside the cabin, Ahyoka rose to her feet. The sound of her name being dragged across the desert wind had struck deeper than any wound. Memories flared, the flames, the screams, the betrayal that had cast her into the dust to die. She pressed a hand against the doorframe, her body trembling. Another voice joined the first, cruel and jeering. "Come out, girl. We'll make it quick this time." The words cut like a blade. Ahyoka's breath shuddered, her legs weakening. For a moment she thought she would fall. But then her eyes caught the back of John's shoulders, broad and unmoving, a wall between her and the men outside. He had not wavered, not once since the day he carried her bleeding from the sand. The desert was silent, waiting. The riders shifted restlessly, their horses stamping.
The last light of day bled across the sky, turning the land the color of fire. Ahyoka stepped forward, her shadow stretching across the floor. The time had come. For a heartbeat, she lingered in the doorway, the firelight behind her, the desert dusk before. Her body shook with exhaustion, but her eyes burned with something sharper than fear. Then, with a breath that seemed to draw strength from the earth itself, Ahyoka stepped past John. The riders' heads snapped up, surprise flashing across their faces as the girl they had hunted now stood before them. She was thinner than when they had last seen her, scarred, her dress patched in rough stitches. Yet the sight of her alive, unbowed, struck them harder than any bullet. John shifted instinctively, as though to pull her back, but she lifted her hand, palm out, halting him. Her body, fragile and trembling, placed itself squarely between him and the rifles across the corral. "No more," she said, her voice raw but steady. The wind carried it clear. "I will not return." The leader's sneer faltered. His horse stamped, restless beneath him. "You think you have a choice, girl? You were promised." "You belong." "I belong to no man," she cut in, her tone fierce, carrying the weight of every scar, every loss, every betrayal. "You took from me all you could take, but you will not take what is left." The men shifted in their saddles, unsettled. John's rifle was still raised, but it was her words that held the ground. One of the riders muttered to the leader, but the man silenced him with a glance. His eyes narrowed on Ahyoka, sharp and calculating. "So you choose him, this rancher? You think he can keep you?" Her hand, still raised, trembled, but she did not lower it. She glanced at John, her eyes catching his for the briefest instant. In that moment, she found steadiness. "I choose myself," she said, "and the life you tried to steal from me." The silence that followed was heavy, stretched taut as a drawn bowstring. The desert itself seemed to lean closer, waiting for the snap. John's heart thundered, his finger brushing the trigger, ready to end it if they advanced. But the men hesitated. For the first time, they saw not a girl to be dragged back, but a woman standing on ground she had claimed as her own. John's voice joined hers then, low and steady, a vow renewed. She stays here. Together, they faced the line of riders, 2 figures against 5, the sun dying behind them in a blaze of fire. And in that fragile dusk, the stand was made. The riders shifted uneasily, their horses tossing their heads, as if they too sensed the weight of the moment. The leader's sneer faltered, though his eyes stayed sharp on Ahyoka. He had expected her to crawl back in chains, not to stand before him, scarred yet unbroken. John raised the rifle higher, the iron sight steady between them. His silence was as firm as stone, his presence a wall no dust storm could shake.
The barrel glinted with the last fire of sunset, a reminder that this rancher was not a man who bluffed. The men muttered among themselves. One cursed under his breath, another spat into the sand. They saw the rifle, they saw the fire in Ahyoka's eyes. And somewhere deep in their bones, they felt the desert pressing in, the vastness that swallowed the weak, the silence that marked graves unmarked and forgotten. Ahyoka's voice cut through that silence. "I am not yours," she said, each word carved from the marrow of her soul. "I will not go back, not now, not ever." The leader's mouth twisted, caught between fury and calculation. He opened his lips to retort, but John's voice broke in first, low and steady. "If God is for us, who can be against us?" The verse fell heavy into the dusk, older and stronger than any threat. It was not shouted, it was spoken like truth already proven by the very mountains around them. For a long breath, no one moved. The riders looked from John's rifle to Ahyoka's unyielding stance, to the gathering dark that seemed to close in around them. One shifted in his saddle, muttering, "Not worth it." Another tugged his reins, his horse backing away. The leader's jaw clenched, pride fought with instinct, but in the end, instinct won. He spat into the dust, gave a sharp tug on his reins, and turned his horse. One by one, the others followed, their shadows stretching long across the sand as the last light bled from the sky. John did not lower the rifle until their shapes dissolved into the horizon, swallowed by distance and dust. Only then did he exhale, a long, steady breath that left his body heavy with the release of held tension.
Beside him, Ahyoka trembled, but she did not collapse. Her hand, uncertain yet firm, reached for his sleeve. She did not speak. She did not need to. Her touch was the answer to a question neither had dared ask aloud. The desert wind rose again, soft and cool, carrying away the last echoes of hooves. Night gathered around the ranch, but within the circle of firelight they remained. Two lives scarred by loss, yet still standing. The enemy had retreated. The storm had passed, but the choice that mattered had already been made. The dust settled slowly, drifting back to earth like ashes from a fire long burned out. In the distance, the riders were no more than shadows dissolving into the horizon. The desert, so tense moments before, exhaled into silence. John lowered the rifle at last, the wood warm against his palms. He leaned it against the porch rail, his body heavy, shoulders sagging, as though the weight of months had just pressed down all at once. For a moment he stood motionless, listening to the stillness, unsure whether to trust it. Behind him, Ahyoka swayed where she stood. The fierceness that had carried her through the confrontation bled away, leaving her trembling. She caught herself against the post, her breath uneven. Then, slowly, she reached for him. Her fingers closed around his arm, small yet firm, anchoring herself against his steady frame. It was not a plea, it was not gratitude. It was something deeper, the unspoken recognition that she was no longer alone. John turned his head, their eyes meeting in the dim firelight spilling from the cabin. He saw the weariness in her face, but also the ember of something that had survived the storm, the fever, the pursuit. Trust, fragile but real. He covered her hand with his own, rough and calloused, a gesture more binding than words. For all his solitude, for all her scars, in that moment they shared a vow without needing to speak it. They would not abandon what had been forged here. The desert night closed around them, filled with the chirr of crickets and the distant cry of coyotes. The danger was gone, but the mark of it lingered in the air. John knew it would return someday. Danger always did in lands like these. But tonight there was peace enough. They moved back into the cabin, the fire burning low, shadows stretching long across the walls.
Ahyoka settled onto the cot, her body folding into rest.
She did not resist when John adjusted the blanket over her shoulders. Her hand still clung faintly to his sleeve until sleep pulled it loose. John sat nearby, the rifle close, his eyes on the flames. Yet his mind was not on the weapon, nor the men retreating into the dark. It was on the touch of her hand, the sound of her voice when she declared her freedom, the weight of the verse he had spoken standing before them all. He whispered once more into the silence, not as a vow this time, but as a quiet prayer. "Thank you, Lord." The cabin breathed with the hush of exhausted peace. Outside, the desert stars burned clear, witnesses to the stand that had been made. Spring crept into the desert with a quiet stubbornness. The storms eased, the nights softened, and the hard ground cracked open to let wildflowers bloom. Yellow blossoms dotted the dry creek beds, red petals clung to the rocky slopes, and the air carried the faint sweetness of mesquite. John had seen it all before, but this year the desert felt different. For the first time in years, he was not alone to witness its renewal. The days settled into rhythm.
At dawn, John saddled the old mare and rode the pastures, checking the cattle that still grazed, thin but alive. He carried back wood, water, and sometimes a rabbit caught in a snare. At the ranch, Ahyoka was no longer a silent shadow on the cot. She met him at the door with tasks already begun: mending worn cloth, sweeping the hearth, tending a small patch of earth where she had pressed seeds into soil. She moved carefully, her body still bearing the weight of scars, but there was purpose in her steps. John watched her from a distance as she worked, the quiet determination of her hands reminding him of his mother in the old days, making something out of nothing, refusing to surrender to barren ground. Evenings drew them together by the fire. She simmered broth from whatever he brought, herbs added with a care that gave flavor to even the plainest meal. He split wood, mended tack, or sat sharpening his knife while she hummed under her breath. The tune was often the same, the haunting melody of her people, rising and falling with the crackle of flame. He still did not know the words, but he listened as if by listening he honored what had been lost.
Sometimes, when the silence stretched long, their eyes met across the fire. Neither spoke. Yet in those moments, something unspoken passed between them. A recognition, a fragile trust built from nights of fever and days of survival. John noticed small things, the way she touched the beads she had managed to string back together, each one a piece of memory she refused to abandon. The way her shoulders no longer tensed each time he stepped into the room. The way she lingered a moment longer when their hands brushed while passing a bowl. For his part, he found himself speaking more than he had in years. Not much, but enough. A remark about the cattle, a note about the weather. Once, when a hawk circled high above, he told her how his father used to say the hawk was God's reminder to lift your eyes higher than the dust. She listened, her head tilted, and though she did not answer, her eyes softened. At night, when the desert cooled and the stars burned bright, John sometimes caught her standing just beyond the porch, her face turned west. He knew what she was thinking. Beyond the ridges lay her people, her past, the bloodline she had been torn from. Honor whispered for her to return. He did not call her back inside, did not press her with words. He only waited, splitting logs or feeding the fire, until she returned on her own. The days stretched into weeks. Slowly, the ranch began to feel less like a place haunted by solitude, and more like a home shared, though neither of them spoke the word aloud. One evening, after a long day's ride, John came back to find Ahyoka sitting on the porch, a woven basket in her lap, her hands busy repairing a torn shirt of his with thread finer than he ever used. She looked up as he approached, her eyes meeting his without flinching. He paused, caught off guard by the simple picture: the house behind her, the desert blooming around them, the sun sinking low. Something stirred in his chest, something he had long thought buried. Belonging. It was not spoken, not asked for, but it was there, growing quietly between them, as stubborn and enduring as the flowers that pushed through the desert stone. The heat of spring deepened, and with it the ranch settled into a rhythm that felt older than either of them. Work filled the days, chores that demanded muscle and patience, the kind of tasks that measured time not in hours but in seasons. John carried water, mended fences, rode the cattle line. Ahyoka tended the small patch of earth by the porch, coaxing fragile shoots from the sand. In their labor, they found a strange kind of companionship, wordless, steady, necessary. At night, when the work was done, they sat near the fire. Sometimes she hummed, sometimes he told a brief story from years past, always clipped as if words were still rationed. Yet silence no longer weighed on them as it once had. It became something shared, a covenant stronger than speech. One evening, the wind stirred soft across the desert, carrying the scent of mesquite bloom. Ahyoka sat mending the last of John's shirts, her fingers deft, while he cleaned his rifle on the other side of the fire. The quiet stretched, warm and unbroken. She set the cloth aside at last and looked at him. Not a long look, not searching, but steady, as if acknowledging what had grown between them. Her hand moved, hesitant at first, then resting lightly on the rough wood of the table near his own. John glanced down, his weathered fingers brushing against hers. He did not close the distance fully, not yet, but the touch was enough. In it lay the memory of storms survived, of tears shed unseen, of choices made in blood and dust. No vows were spoken, no promises etched, but in that silence something deeper bound them, a trust forged not by words but by endurance. Days passed. The wildflowers began to fade, their blossoms scattering into the wind. But the memory of their bloom lingered in the air. Ahyoka no longer stood each night staring westward. Instead, she lingered on the porch, watching the stars, her shoulders no longer taut with the strain of departure. John joined her sometimes, leaning against the post, both of them gazing into the vast spread of sky. It was not comfort they sought, but presence. To stand together beneath the same silence was enough. One night, thunder rolled faintly over the horizon, rare and distant. The air smelled of rain, a gift seldom given in the desert. Ahyoka lifted her face to the wind, eyes closed. John watched her, the lines of his face softened in the dim light. For a moment he thought of all that had brought them here, his solitude, her flight, the blood spilled into the sand. He thought of the vow he had spoken without meaning to, the vow that had bound him more tightly than he ever expected. "I won't leave you alone." The words rose again in his chest, but he did not speak them. He didn't need to. She already knew. Instead, he whispered into the night, voice low but sure. "God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble." Psalm 46:1. The verse carried into the wind, joining the rumble of thunder, settling into the silence between them like a stone set in the foundation of something lasting. Ahyoka opened her eyes, turned to him, and nodded once. She did not smile, but her gaze held steadiness, the quiet recognition that she had chosen, and that choice would hold. John returned the nod, and together they stood as the first drops of rain touched the desert earth. It was not rescue, not deliverance, but something rarer, belonging. And in the covenant of silence, it was enough. Stories like John and Ahyoka's remind us that the frontier was never only about guns and dust, but about hearts tested in silence, about faith found in the harshest deserts, and about the fragile seed of belonging that could grow even in barren ground. Many who lived in those days carried scars we cannot see, yet they endured, not because the West was easy, but because they chose to stand, to protect, and to love in the face of loss. Perhaps you, too, have known seasons of solitude, storms that seemed endless, or moments where faith was the only thread to hold. Their story is not just theirs, it is ours, a reminder of the strength God plants in even the most weary souls. If this touched your heart, stay with us for more true Wild West stories, tales of courage, faith, and the enduring hope that still speaks to us today.